WW3 closer than ever, NATO vs Russia tensions explode. That's what everyone seems to be asking these days. The air is thick with tension between NATO and Russia. Claims are getting bolder, warnings are growing louder, and the fear that miscalculation could ignite a global conflict is creeping in. So let's dig into everything, what's happening right now, what could happen next, and what it means for all of us. It starts with Russia, warning that any direct conflict with NATO could push the world into World War III. President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly said that a confrontation between NATO and Moscow would bring us all dangerously close to a global war. And that's not just rhetoric, these messages carry serious weight. First post, +2 investing. Com +2. Putin's framing this not just as a risk, but as a likely outcome if things spiral further out of control. On NATO's side, various members are stepping up their military posture, especially in Eastern Europe. Border regions, particularly the Baltics, Poland, and Finland, are seeing increased Russian military presence and drills, while NATO responds with exercises of its own, deploying troops, armor, aircraft, and infrastructure to show readiness and deterrence. Wikipedia, +3 AP News, +3 AP News, +3. A recent big NATO exercise in the Baltic region featured thousands of personnel from many member nations, showcasing rapid deployment and coordinated defense strategies. AP News. Tensions boil over when incidents cross borders. Poland, a NATO member, reported multiple Russian drones violating its airspace during Russian attacks in Ukraine. Polish forces, aided by NATO, shot down several drones, calling these incursions acts of aggression. In response, Poland invoked Article 4 of the NATO Treaty, a mechanism to consult with other NATO members when a country feels threatened. Reuters +2, The Washington Post +2. While Article 5 binds members to collective defense, Article 4 is more about dialogue, but even this step signals the seriousness of the situation. The Washington Post +1. Russia, meantime, isn't holding back either in its rhetoric. Medvedev and other Kremlin officials have repeatedly accused Finland, now a NATO member, of preparing offensives, of being part of NATO's perceived threat to Russia. Moscow also warns of catastrophic consequences if NATO's infrastructure moves closer to Russian borders. The Times +1. Russian military doctrine even explicitly lists things like NATO expansion and foreign military presence near Russia as external dangers. Wikipedia. So what are some of the possible escalation points, the sparks that could set this off? First, airspace violations already happen. Drones, aircraft. If those become more frequent, or one of them goes down in a NATO country, retaliation choices will matter enormously. Second, deployments. Building up forces along the border, both Russian troops and NATO reinforcements, increases tension simply by proximity. It's a dangerous game of brinkmanship. Third, nuclear rhetoric. Russia's doctrine includes provisions for using nuclear weapons in certain extreme scenarios. The more NATO pushes back, the more Russia might rely on that threat to deter further escalation. Wikipedia +2 first post +2. Nothing about this is just theoretical anymore. Estonia's intelligence service recently assessed that Russia is preparing for potential military conflict with NATO within the next decade, including doubling troop numbers on its border with the Baltics and Finland. Anadolu Agency. NATO's own actions, military exercises, fortification of logistics, infrastructure improvements indicate that they're preparing for more than just diplomacy. Let me pause and contrast what this means versus what people fear. Many fear that WW3 means nuclear war, total annihilation. While that possibility exists in theory, in practice both sides recognize the devastating consequences. That doesn't mean deterrence won't fail, but it means that both Russia and NATO still weigh escalation carefully. Wars between nuclear powers tend to happen by mistake, miscommunication, or unintended escalation, not because anyone actively wants them. So far, that seems like the biggest risk: a skirmish over territory, a radar misidentification, an overzealous response. And once one side responds militarily inside another's zone, it's hard to contain. There's also the question of alliances. NATO is collective. An attack on one member could bring the others in, but not all members are equally committed to risk. Some are more cautious, others more aggressive. Internal divisions deepen as NATO balances between deterrence and avoiding direct war. On the Russian side, alliances like with Belarus or strategic ties with non-aligned countries matter, but Russia's isolation by sanctions and diplomatic pressure has weakened alternative paths for escalation without direct conflict. Let's look at recent developments. Poland's shooting down drones triggered Article 4. Germany is leading Quadriga, a major NATO exercise focused on reinforcing Baltic countries. Russia and Belarus are conducting military drills, including in areas near NATO borders. Finland is seeing increased tension over Russian accusations it's preparing for attack, which Russia claims is justified by NATO's presence. AP News +1. Another major flashpoint, Kaliningrad. This Russian exclave, sandwiched between Poland and Lithuania, has long been a geographic and strategic pressure point. NATO generals have recently said that the alliance now has the ability to move into Kaliningrad more rapidly than ever, which has prompted fierce Russian warnings that any move against it would be viewed as an attack on all of Russia under its nuclear doctrine, the Sun. So, where are things heading? We can imagine three broad scenarios. 1. Tensions escalate but stay below the threshold of full war. More airspace violations, more border posturing, hybrid warfare, but both sides pull back just before crossing into open conflict. That's plausible. 2. Miscalculation leads to limited conflict, a border clash, naval confrontation, or direct military exchange over a disputed area. That could lead to localized escalation, perhaps involving non-NATO states or asymmetric actions. 3. Worst case, escalating responses spiral, alliances trigger, nuclear deterrence fails in the sense that threats become action, and global war becomes unavoidable. None of those outcomes are inevitable, but the more each side builds up, the harder it becomes to avoid scenario 2 or 3. What matters most in avoiding war is clarity of communication, restraint, and diplomacy backed by credible defense. Clean channels of negotiation, agreed rules of engagement, confidence, building measures, de-escalation frameworks. Those exist, but they are under strain. What can the rest of the world do, and what should you know? For countries far from Europe, there are economic implications. Sanctions, supply disruptions, energy prices, global markets reacting to fear. For citizens everywhere, it means preparing mentally for instability and watching how governments respond where they place resources, how they prioritize diplomacy versus military spending. One thing to keep in mind, war doesn't start with cannon fire. It often starts with political rhetoric, mutual accusations, small infractions, and right now, all of those are happening. Statements from top leaders warning about catastrophic consequences. Many claim that NATO is attempting regime change. Others accuse Russia of destabilizing behavior. That kind of language builds mistrust. And once trust is gone, misinterpretation or false alarms are much more likely. Also, psychological warfare counts. Media stories that emphasize WW3 are not always objective. They often amplify the most alarming possibilities because that gets attention. The danger is that public perception and panic can feed into government decisions. If people expect war, governments may feel compelled to act more aggressively to show strength. That alone can push things over the brink. In terms of de-escalation, here's what could work. Reinstating communication mechanisms like arms control treaties, transparency over military movements, joint observation, limiting troop buildups near borders, international diplomacy through neutral mediators. Confidence, building steps like declaring no first, use of nuclear weapons, even pulling some forces back to non-provocative positions. So what's the verdict? Is WW3 closer than ever? In many ways, yes, we are closer now than we were a few years ago. NATO and Russia are in a state of direct confrontation, or at least mutual warning. Military forces are on edge. Very little is taken for granted anymore, but it's not inevitable, not yet. There is room to avoid the worst outcomes, though that window is narrowing. For you, the viewer, pay attention, read reliable sources, question alarmist claims, understand just how dangerous escalation is. Your vote, your voice, your demand for rational diplomacy matters. Governments respond to pressure, external as well as internal. Support those pushing for peace over posturing. WW3 closer than ever. NATO vs Russia tensions explode. May sound sensational, but it captures something real. The risk is growing. That doesn't mean panic. It means staying informed, staying realistic, and hoping that leaders act with caution, restraint, and humanity. Thanks for watching. Please comment with your thoughts. Do you think we're already too far down the path, or is there still time to pull back? See you in the next video.